So we are now really done with the PDO implementation of our query builder. We're going to quickly do the one for MySQLi. So we're going to come here and create a new class and then call this MySQLi query builder. Okay, and then this is also going to extend the query builder class. And then I'm going to have those methods. So we're going to basically allow my test editor to inject those methods for me. And then we can begin to implement them one after the other, just like we did for PDO. For MySQLi, it's really confusing and tiring sometimes because I don't use MySQLi. So I'm doing this basically for you who would like to really use MySQLi. Okay, so I prefer to use PDO because the API is really fluent and then really nice to use. So we want to have some private property here called result set. And then another one will be the actual results. Okay, so. And then we're going to have some constants here. So we're going to have const parent type. So when we're doing binding in MySQLi, we need to specify the type of binding, which can be an integer. It could be a string. It could be a float or double. So I'm going to say type int. And the way that we represent int will be I. I'm going to duplicate this for the tree that we want to support. So the next one will be string represented by X, and the next one will be D for double. So let's call this a string. And then let's call this double. So we've introduced 2 new properties and 3 constants. For PDO, we didn't have to introduce anything. We could just easily tap into what we already have and then get things done. Okay, so for the get method, what we want to do here is to just return the results. Okay, but with MySQLi, once we already get that result set from the statement, if we attempt to use it somewhere else again, we are not going to be able to actually do that. So let me show you a very basic example. Come to the PDO query. You can see here, I'm using the statement to fetch all. I'm also using statement to get the row count. In MySQLi, we cannot do this. Once we get the result set for the statement, if we attempt to use it here again, then we're going to get null. It will not have any value in it. So we need to really be careful. And that's really why I have those 2 other properties there. So I'm going to say if we don't have a result set, so if not this result set, if we don't have a result set, then what we want to do will be to actually populate the result set, and then from the result set we can actually get the results. So we can say this result set should be equal to this statement. So this will be a MySQLi statement, and then we can say get underscore results. So once we get the result here inside of the result set, okay, and then we can now say this result so this result should now be equal to this result set fetch all. Okay, so this is a method to fetch all of the record from the database, and we can also specify how we want to fetch. So we could pass in a constant here to say MySQLi assoc, or we could just say 1. And then we can then say return results, or this result. Okay, so I hope this is clear enough. So what we're doing is ensuring that we don't already have a value in the result set. As I mentioned before, if we already have a value here and we attempt to use it again, and then we're going to get null, because the first time that you use it and then say get result, if you attempt to do this again, you're going to get null, and that will be an error. And really, we need it to actually successfully get our count method to work properly. Okay, so we're going to say if we don't have a result set, so if there is no result set, so it means that we have not yet called the get method. So remember that we have right here, if not result set. So if there's no result set, we call the get method, it creates a result set. And then this property now has a value. But here, if we don't have anything, it means that we have not yet called that get method. It means that we just want to do a count. So we can then say this get. So we call the get method. This helps us to populate the result set and also the result. And then we can then also just count the result. So we can then say return this result set. Okay, and then we can put a question mark here to say we want to get the number of rows. This result set, and then let's get the number of rows, num underscore rows. Otherwise, we could just say 0 or false. Okay, so let's say false or 0. So in any case, this will be 0 in PHP. But if we want to really use this as an integer to count something, we may want to just return the integer 0. But in any case, this is not a problem for us now. All right, so let's move on to the last insert ID for MySQLi. So we can say return this connection last. For MySQLi is just insert underscore ID. Okay, that's also pretty simple. And then we need to also do the prepare, which is pretty much straightforward. So we're going to say return this connection prepare. And then we can pass in query. Okay, so for execute, this is where we now need to do like things really differently from PDO. Okay, so we want to first of all check if we have a statement. Okay, so we're going to say if not statement. If we don't have a statement, so when we call the execute method, we pass it a statement. If this is false, we don't want to continue. So we want to throw an exception. So we may throw new, let's say not found exception. It could be better. MySQLi, let's say MySQLi statement is false. So we probably could use a better exception here. So let's just come here and see we have invalid log level, missing argument. So can we say missing argument or invalid argument? Let's have one more invalid argument that we can use generically. So invalid argument exception extent base exception. Okay, so right here in query builder, MySQLi query builder, I can then say invalid argument exception, and we can do the same thing also in our query builder class. Later we'll do that. So let's just continue. So if we don't have a statement, we say invalid argument, MySQLi statement is false. And then we want to do a next check. So the next check that we want to do is to see if we actually have bindings. Okay. So if this bindings means it's bindings not empty for that run of this class. So if binding is not empty, it means that we need to do some basic things here. So first thing we want to do is to say bindings. It's pretty much different for MySQLi. And then we want to have a method here to prepare our bindings. So we're going to say pass bindings. And this will take these bindings. So we need this method to really prepare the binding the way that it will work with MySQLi. If you look at the diagram again, you can see that I have this method there for MySQLi. Pass bindings, okay, and then pass binding type. So we need these two methods, okay. So let's get back again to the code. So we're going to create this method, but we can really just continue right now, okay. So what we want to do next is to use reflection. So we're going to say reflection object. So this is the PHP reflection API. So we're going to say this should be equal to reflection class. We're doing this because we want to be able to automatically bind the parameters and also to call the method. So we want to automatically be able to bind parameters. So we want to say get MySQLi, SQLi underscore statement, okay? STMT, so this is the class. MySQLi statement, this is a class. We want to get that class. And then we want to say the method that we want to trigger is going to be bind parameters. And we're doing this because we want to bind the parameters dynamically. So we get that method. So get method. And then we pass it the method name, which is going to be bind underscore params. Okay, and then we can now call this method with a number of arguments. Okay, so we can say method invoke argument. So we can say invoke argument, and this will take the statement and then the bindings. So what we're now trying to achieve is to dynamically bind a number of arguments, unlimited number of arguments, okay? We want to dynamically be able to bind unlimited number of arguments. And what this does is similar to call user func array in PHP. It will automatically trigger and then perform the operation for us, okay? So once this is done, we can then say this execute. So really not this execute, we want to say statement execute. Okay, so because we're executing on the statement, and then we want to set bind this to be equal to empty string. So we say this bindings equal to an empty array, sorry, not empty strings. And we do the same thing for placeholders. And then we want to return statement. Okay, so let's just return the statement. Okay, so this is all we need to do for the execute method for MySQLi. We now need to create the method pass bindings, okay? And that is going to need another method which is called pass binding type. You remember at the top here we have some constants which basically represent the type of bindings that we want to support, integer, strings, and doubles. Okay, so we're going to have two more methods. There'll be EPA methods. So the first one I could just copy from here, pass bindings. So there should be S here. And then here I have a public, or we could make this private. It's never used outside. Private function pass bindings, and this is going to take an array of params. So inside of here we want to have a variable. Let's call it bindings. Should be equal to an empty array. So what we basically want to do here is dynamic binding, okay? Because we don't know the number of values that will be in the placeholders and in our bindings. So what we now need to do is to do it dynamically. And usually in MySQLi, the way that you do this is you will say statement. So statement, and then you will call bind underscore param. Okay, and then you're going to specify the binding type. So if it is string, this will be S, okay? And S here will mean that you're going to bind one value. Okay, so maybe that will be data. Okay, but if we have more than one values in our parameters here, it means that for each of the bindings, okay, for each of the bindings, we need to specify the type of binding. So we can have something like SID. So the first one, the first two will be strings, and then the third one will be an integer, and then the fourth one will be a double. So that will correspond to the values that we have here. Okay, so let's say a string, and then let's say integer, and then let's say double. Okay, so this is the way that we will use binding in MySQLi. So we want to do this dynamically. Okay, the first value needs to be correspond to the number of argument that we have. So if it's 4, we need to have 4 binding type here. Okay, so let's first of all write the method to give us that value. And before we do that, we need to know what's inside of the params, how many values that we have inside of the param. So we're going to count that. So that will be equal to count of params. So once we count the params, if actually the param count is equal to 0, we just want to return. So if count is equal to 0, we don't want to do anything. So we can just say return this bindings. Okay, it means that there's nothing to process. Okay, but if that is not the case, then we need to get the binding types. So this is the first argument that we need to pass to the bind underscore param method that we are calling automatically in our execute method here. Okay, so this, the first argument is the type. Okay, and the type, whatever we put there, should correspond to the number of arguments that we have, or the number of values that we want to pass in our params. Okay, so I'm going to say binding types is going to be equal to this get or pass binding types. Let's say pass binding types. And for this, we don't want to pass it any argument, okay? We're going to get all of that automatically. So we're going to have a public function pass binding type, and inside of here we want to do like a really easy for each and build up an array and just return back a string. Okay, so we're going to say binding types, which is really what we need to use outside of this method, should be equal to an empty array. And then we can loop through the bindings. So we can say for each these bindings as binding. Okay, and then right here we can do a really simple check. Okay, so if the binding is an integer, then we're going to add to the binding types an integer type. Okay, so if it's int, we can use the PHP inbuilt functions bindings. It means that the binding that we need will be the integer type. So we can then say binding types is equal to sef. So what we need is the param type int, okay, which will just be I. And then we're going to just copy this. And then for the three that we're supporting, if it's string, which is the second one, if it's string, and then we're going to have param type string. And then if it's a float, that's PHP. So if this is float, param type double. And that's all we need to do here for the check, but we need to return something from this function. So we can then say return implode. So we want to implode this, and the glue that we want to use to implode this would just be an empty space. Should now be binding types. Okay. Okay, so when we do this, what we will have, assuming that we have in this bindings array, we have a value like this. So we have X, which is for string, and then we have a comma. So this is the way the array would probably be like, okay? And then we have a D, and then we have another S here, okay? So we have another S here. So when we call implode like this, it's just going to return us a string that's going to be equal to this, SIDX, okay? Which is basically the value that we need to pass to the bind param method. So that will be the first value that we need to pass to that method. Okay, so we have this method set up. Let's now go up here. Okay, so once we call this, we will get a string, which will be something like this. So it will be a string SIDS, depending on the number of values that we have in the bindings and also the types of that value. Okay, if the type is an integer, we have I. If it's a string, we have S. Okay, so that's pretty much simple. So we can now continue with our pass binding method to just quickly finish it. So the first thing that we need to pass to this array will be the binding type, okay, and then we're going to pass it by reference, okay. So binding type, we'll say equal to ampersand, and then we'll say binding types. So we already have the type of binding, which is the first argument that we need to pass to bind param. The next one, we just need to do a loop through. So we're going to say for index is equal to 0. And then we're going to ensure that index is less than count. So remember, count is the number of values that we have inside of param. Okay. So we can say less than count. Then we want to increment index. So we can say index plus plus. And then inside of this for loop, we just want to pass values to bindings, to add the values to bindings. So we can say bindings, because there's an array, equal, pass by reference. And then we can say param, and then the index. Okay, so the key will be the index. That way we can get the value in the order that it is being passed into the bindings. So the values passed into bindings, the order. So if we have 1, 2, 3, 4, it will be in that order bind back to these bindings. And then we can just return bindings. And return this, no, just bindings, okay? So we get our bindings, and then we get the type working. And then there's one last method that we need to write here. So that will be the fetch into. So as you saw for PDO, it was really, really simple. But for MySQLi, it's also not that simple. We need to do some little more check to ensure that this works fine. So let's have a variable here that will be equal to an empty array. We call this role. Or we say rows, which represent all of the rows from the database. And then we can say this result set should be equal to this statement get result. So exactly the same thing that we did previously. Get result. And then here we're going to say y role. Okay, so that will be role. Or we can actually call this an object because we're going to be fetching this as an object class basically. So let's say while object is equal to this result set. So we're going to say this result set, and then the method that we want is fetch object, fetch underscore object. And the reason why we're doing this is because for MySQLi, fetch object usually just returns one result set. It doesn't return everything. Okay, so if we have 20 results inside of result set, if we say fetch object, it just returns the first one. Okay, but we want to now loop through using the while loop. So while we still have data inside of result set, okay, we want to grab it as an object and then push it into rows. Okay, rows could also be named result in this sense. So we could also call this result. So let's say equal to the object. So we push each of the objects from the result set into this, which we can call results. Okay, so if we want to use something that's like count, we can really just set the results of this object, which is now MySQLi query builder, to be equal to the final value that we have here. And then right here, we can just do that easily by saying this result. That way we can still do a count on it. Okay, this result equals to result. So what is now being returned here will be objects of this class. Whatever class is being passed into here, okay, we want to fetch the result into that class and then return the object. So if we have multiple records, we're going to return all of them. In the end, this method returns an array. So that's pretty much all that we need to do here, I guess so. Then I can get rid of that.